Arthur Kent. Outside of Asia, the largest Buddhist community in the world lives right here in Canada, in Halifax. The members of that community are mostly American. Tonight on Man Alive, why hundreds of well-educated Yanks would stream across the border to a small, out-of-the-way city that's long on tradition, but not exactly known for Eastern philosophy. It was an unusual migration. In the 1980s, 500 high-powered, go-getting young Americans picked up and moved to slow-paced Halifax. They came at the request of their Buddhist teacher, a brilliant and controversial Tibetan called Trungpa Rinpoche. Trungpa believed that if Buddhism was going to take root in the West, it should be more down to earth, and the naturalness of the Nova Scotians and their tolerance for the unusual made, in his view, fertile soil.
Whether they're nice, yeah, they're generally nice, yes. But like most Canadians also are generally nice, so.
Yeah, they're American though.
Is that right? Oh!
It's not a bad religion?
No.
It's a good religion. Yeah. Well, as long as it's a good religion, it's a Christian religion, isn't it?
I guess I'm not well informed. I've never been educated really on that topic.
Although relatively unknown to the average man in the street, they quickly had an impact on the commercial and artistic life of the city.
As a collectivity, they've brought a lot of thoughtfulness and a lot of creative inspiration to the community. You can drive around, you can point to buildings, you can point to businesses that have started, all of which have significantly enhanced this area.
When I moved back here in '86, the Buddhist community then, I guess, was just starting to form here in fairly big numbers. And I was working in the entertainment section in this paper and covering dance and theater and restaurants and any place where you could put your time and money. And every time I turned around, bumped into a Buddhist. The best cafe in town is Buddhist owned, the best bakery, a couple of the best restaurants, one of the most important people in dance, the head of the film festival, actors, writers, children's writers. After the community got rolling, they started doing programs that Nova Scotians could get involved with too. So that if you want your kid to, learn how to write or how a story is put together, if there's a program in Halifax, chances are there's a Buddhist somewhere behind it.
Generally, these Buddhists are well-educated professional people, professors, engineers, designers, and most of them found work with relative ease. The greatest difficulty they had was adapting to the unexpected differences in the culture.
In Canada, if you're American, you think, yeah, it's pretty much North American culture, can't be that different, but in fact it is.
When I was first here, is I would pretend people were speaking a foreign language. I really would do that, be in a restaurant and say, I don't understand a word that's being spoken. And then all of a sudden I feel comfortable again.
As an American and as someone who's fairly active, for me I had to slow down several speeds in order to synchronize at all. And I still find myself sitting behind lines of cars here in traffic thinking, why are these people just sitting here? They should go around themselves. There's nobody in the other lane. So I go in the other lane and I go and it works. And I think, why are they sitting there? They're amazingly patient. And I get home 30 seconds later and I think, wow, that's a real achievement.
I responded immediately and wholeheartedly to the idea of coming here when the idea was first introduced back in the early 80s, because it meant having a home.
Back then, they were hippie kids. The story of their transformation to Haligonian respectability is a kind of modern mixture of Exodus with Pygmalion, scripted by their extraordinary Tibetan teacher, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche.
What you have recommended to us is that we should cut off our long hair, put on neckties, and re-enter the mainstream of American institutions and attempt to exert a wholesome influence from within.
That's right.
There was a kind of honey in his being that attracted, even when sometimes his behavior repelled. And
it was always a question for one whether one was more attracted or more repelled.
James George was the Canadian ambassador to India when the Tibetans went into exile. Trungpa stayed with them in the residence for 3 months and was like a member of the family.
When he was getting ready to leave us and go to Scotland, I said to him, you know, Trungpa, you're not going to stay in Scotland. It's too small for you. You're going to go to America. It's big. So are you.
In the United States, Trungpa quickly achieved a celebrated notoriety. Not your average holy man, the 11th incarnation of the Trungpa line fit the excesses of the early 70s. He openly drank and smoked and was unapologetic about sleeping with his female students. And unlike most teachers from the East, he quickly mastered American speech and culture.
Whenever there's freedom is presented, there should be some sense of respect and a fear to it.
His direct style allowed him to reach all kinds of counterculture types. Some, like beat poet Allen Ginsberg, became his students.
So he was able to tune into the very nature of things and present that in a very simple way. He was a master of spoken language, and that of course aided it a great deal, as well as having absorbed high culture at Oxford, philosophy and religion, and hippie culture, and beat culture, and grunge culture, and punk culture. But Trungpa took on the whole gamut of Americans, whether upper middle class, three-piece suit types, or wild acid heads, and was able to talk to them.
He would speak to academic communities, cultural communities, arts communities, and he may appear a half hour late, or he may sit in his seat for 20 minutes before saying a word. He may appear gentle one evening or fierce the next. Trungpa Rinpoche was a man of many faces, literally, and many talents, but he did break expectations.
He wore outdoor shirt with suspenders and boots and smoked cigarettes and drank and did what everybody else was doing. And in that way, he communicated to people. He started there. If he had tried to start someplace further beyond that, he wouldn't have communicated.
In the early 70s, Trungpa wrote several books that became instant spiritual hits, and students flocked to him in numbers unprecedented for a Buddhist teacher in North America. But his success did nothing to temper his behavior. In Buddhism, there's a form of teaching called crazy wisdom, a state of mind beyond all conventions, all restraints. Trungpa often applied the term to himself, but others in the Western Buddhist community question whether that was appropriate.
Precisely the nature of what he called crazy wisdom, and what you might call a crazy yogi or an unconventional Roshi or Lama or something, the whole point of it is that it's not a tradition. It's something that's unconventional, you know. It's something that occasional individuals in occasional circumstances do, and so presumably enlightened individuals. But the reason that it's unconventional and that it has shock value when it's done is that it is against tradition, precisely. But there is a little problem in justifying all of Trungpa's behavior with that sort of loophole, you could say, in the Buddhist ethical tradition. And that is that because it's not a tradition, and because it's unconventional, anyone who behaved like that in Buddhist history, who subsequently was accepted as somehow great, did so exceptionally. They didn't do it regularly all the time.
By the time he moved to Nova Scotia in 1985, the drinking, smoking, and late nights had taken their toll. His death of what was generously called heart failure happened a short 8 months later. The funeral attracted 5,000 people. The community, devastated by the loss, was nevertheless reassured by the fact that Trungpa had set up a succession. In the 1970s, Trungpa had appointed Thomas Rich, an American, to be his spiritual heir. Rich was given the title Regent. Like Trungpa, he was open about his sexual relationships, which leaned towards men. The community had a relaxed attitude to sexual conduct, partly because of its hippie roots and because in Tibetan Buddhism, sex can play a role in higher practices. But this was the late 1980s, and their tolerance was about to be severely tested by a public scandal. The story broke in the New York Times. Not only did the regent have AIDS, but he'd been having unprotected sex with members of the community, believing that his spiritual practice would prevent their infection. People were furious. The community was torn apart, and some just quit in disgust. In the end, the regent moved to California with 50 followers, where he died in 1991.
There's no question that people felt betrayed. They felt deceived. And it was widespread, and it went on for a long time.
It caused enormous amount of fractures, divisiveness, doubt, self-doubt, projected doubt of others, questions about, you know, what is loyalty, integrity, truth? Who are we? Have we been naive? Are we naive?
We all put our heads in the sand. And there was a lot of responsibility here that none of us fulfilled, but the key responsibility was to continue to be open to each other. And that's where we nearly died as a community. We stopped being open, and so at the critical point where we should have been communicating very directly, we started communicating in cartoon balloons. And I feel that the regent was part of that. I was part of that. Everyone that virtually I experienced in our world was part of that. And Trungpa Rinpoche, his culpability was in setting that stage. Now, whether he should have or could have, that's an interesting question. But he set that stage, and we had to play out the drama.
Today, having come through fire, this is very much a community concerned with putting down roots in Nova Scotia. The Shambhala Center in downtown Halifax is as much a community center as it is a meditation hall. Buddhist businesses have altered the face of the core of the city, and Buddhists are behind the trendiest shops and cafes. They've invested in real estate, started major engineering companies, and dozens of other enterprises. They have become a force to be reckoned with in the economic and cultural life of the city. Many of them have taken up Kayleys, the traditional music fests of Cape Breton, and when they're not step dancing, they're doing community work.
Health and social well-being that a member of the community is a gerontologist, and involving him in some type of dialogue.
A team of scholars continuously works on translating Tibetan liturgy into English, while in an old North End building, others have set up a school for kids of Buddhists and non-Buddhists alike.
That little stem is not part of the pomade part.
Many locals have joined them in the study of exotic Eastern meditative activities like Japanese archery and in more Western forms of meditation. The leadership of the community has now passed to Trungpa's oldest son, the Sawang Urso Rungtro Mukpo, a quiet young man of 31.
Well, in many ways, what my father had told me many times is that he was planting a seed in this whole process. And that, especially in my upbringing, he was expecting me to carry on the work, so to speak. And, you know, the way he was always talked about it was that he had some kind of burden and he had to carry on the work. That it wasn't just his idea, so to speak, that he'd like to do something, but he really felt some kind of burden in terms of keeping this tradition alive.
We could say that sitting practice of meditation is how to see death and life as it really is. In other words,
Trungpa felt that Buddhism would have to adapt to the North American mentality if it was to take root here. He designed something called Shambhala training to teach the core essence of Buddhist meditation and philosophy, stripped of religious trappings.
of the world at that moment. Your version of the world is being this way or that way.
Particularly for Shambhala training, we use the metaphor of warriorship quite often.
Deborah Ross Webster is one of the 300 or so Canadian members of the community.
And it is basically an approach that looks at approaching your life with a soft front and a strong back. In other words, taking everything in your life in, your job, the garbage, the dishes, your children, your co-workers, and not pushing any of those experiences away, but meeting them head on with some sort of fearlessness, but also with gentleness.
You could say there's some kind of trick, but it's not trick that someone else is playing on us. It's trick that we're playing on ourselves.
Shambhala training is taught internationally at 77 of the community's centers around the world. They note, however, that the biggest public response has been in Halifax. After completing 5 weekends of Shambhala training, many will take refuge vows, the formal step of becoming a Buddhist. Kathy Jones of CBC's This Hour Has 22 Minutes was one of them.
I became aware of the existence of all these Americans, and of course, as a Newfoundlander, we always loved Americans. Oh, there was Americans that came in on the base in Argentia and always had, like, Hershey bars and stockings, and they were cute, and there were lots of them, and they were, you know, they had great, you know, flashing teeth, and we just loved Americans from the teeth on down. And going to Shambhala training, I met a lot of ex-hippie women who are now wearing these very dignified dresses and stuff, and I thought they were all uptight, and I thought, oh, this is terrible. They're so stiff, but they were just sort of doing it. And then as I got to meet people, I met some fantastic personalities, you know. And so I guess I just decided to come here and live here a couple of years ago, and partially because of the community. But I mean, I don't really feel like I've got some kind of community and we're always having, like, you know, potluck suppers or something. But it's nice to know that that's the way it is with Buddhists. You know, anywhere you go, there's a bunch of Buddhists you can hook into, and there's no pretense and no kind of trip, so it's nice.
Fundamentally, what's happened is, particularly in a small town like this, people have met people and they've liked them. And whatever questions may arise about this strange teacher or that bizarre religion, or being an outsider or this and that, fundamentally it all comes down to the people like the other people. Adam York.
Melvin McLeod is a Montrealer who edits the community's monthly magazine. International circulation, 15,000 and climbing, a remarkable number for a publication specifically aimed at Westerners interested in Buddhism.
The only thing I would say about that is that I think we do have a considerable contribution to make, which is the fundamental Vajrayana point of view that the world of the senses and of the sense perceptions of pleasure and pain are not something that is unworkable. That in fact that is all we have to work with in a search for mindfulness and awakening.
One of the difficulties Trungpa faced in adapting Tibetan Buddhism to the West is that it's a religion of contemplation, requiring long hours of study and meditation. How could Westerners learn to juggle the demands of modern life with long periods in retreat? Trungpa approved building Gampo Abbey at a remote site on Cape Breton for the sole purpose of holding retreats. This particular one lasts a month and is considered relatively short. A significant retreat can last 3 years and up. Taking a cue from their teacher, the community came up with a typically Western solution to the problem of taking 3 years off from life, alternating cycles of 6 months in and 6 months out over a period of 6 years. Sequestered off in a separate building, those on a 6-month retreat in cycle have no contact at all with the outside world.
We have a box where we spend most of our life, maybe, let's say 20 hours a day. We sleep in it and we practice in it. And then we have a symbol table in front of us where our ritual instruments are, our texts, our musical instruments.
Most of the Buddhist community of Halifax aspire to do long retreats here someday, learning advanced techniques of meditation to progress along the Buddhist path. Most of them will have to wait, though, until they've dealt with the demands of daily life.
One of the aspects of the Shambhala teachings that I love is that it sort of takes all the obstacles in your life and turns them into practice. And I don't at all consider my daughter an obstacle, but I do consider her a practice. And I have pretty well abandoned the possibility of being able to do a solitary retreat. She's only 11 months old right now. I have other daily practices that I can work around her schedule at the moment, but the focus is definitely Kaylee practice right now.
If there was any doubt among the locals about the community's long-term commitment to the region, it probably began to disappear when Kaylee's took a place beside things like Japanese archery on people's calendars. These days at the Cape Breton Club, it's hard to tell from the flying feet just who are the import Buddhists.
You know, we're here to stay. I'm here to stay. And that gives me a tremendous liberation of some kind because I can make a commitment.
I personally regard this as a giant detox center from materialism.
I travel a lot, and now when I come back here, I always exhale as soon as I hit Nova Scotia.
If many of them were initially reluctant to accept Trungpa's invitation to move to Halifax, most have now happily taken root. 500 sane and sober Americans, relatively speaking, joined by an almost equal number of Canadians, living the legacy of a most unordinary teacher.
Here was a man with obvious faults, and yet one couldn't help loving him. What is it that one loves in such a being? I think it's a sort of resonance. And even when he was being crazy, one felt that it was with a good intention, but he was not an ordinary being. And that is one's attraction. There are lots of ordinary beings who are nice and who teach well and who are ethical and don't have the same attraction. Trungpa was never boring at any stage. And I suppose the response was because one felt the life in him, overflowing life, abundant life, and great love, which comes with great life.
Support.